Hello everyone, welcome back to my class. This is Mejbin Fatima, Commerce lecturer at Elizabeth High School and Junior College. So today in this session, let us proceed towards our 8th chapter of Commerce, that is Business Finance. Now let's begin with our chapter. This chapter will provide an overview of the various sources from where funds can be procured for starting and running a business. It discusses the nature, significance and classification of sources of funds. The factors that determine the choice of a suitable source of business finance also discussed. So in this chapter, we are going to see about the various sources from where the funds can be procured and used for starting and running a business. And let's see its nature, significance and classification of these sources. Now let us see what is the meaning of business finance. The requirement of funds by business firm to accomplish its various activities is called business finance. Finance is considered as the lifeblood of any organization. The sources of the industry depend upon the availability of adequate finance. To promote and operate the purpose enterprise economically and efficiently, adequate finance is necessary. So, we already know that every business firm in order to run needs finance. So, this requirement of funds by business to accomplish or to complete its various activities is called as business finance, and this finance is considered as the lifeblood of any organization, as we already know that no organization can run without finance. So, the sources of an industry will be dependent upon the availability of adequate finance. So, in another terms, finance is labeled as the capital of the company. Now, let's see, there is a definition given of B.O. Wheeler. Let's see. Finance is that business activity which is concerned with the acquisition and conservation of capital funds. So, finance is basically the activity which is concerned with the acquisition and conservation of the capital funds in meeting the financial needs and overall objectives of the business enterprise. The financial needs of the business organization can be categorized into two, that is fixed capital requirements and working capital requirements. Now let's see what is fixed capital requirement. In order to start business, funds are required to purchase fixed assets like land and building, plant and machinery and furniture and factories and furniture and fixtures. This is known as fixed capital requirements for the business enterprise. The funds required in asset remain invested in the business for a long period of time. So, here under fixed capital requirement, as we already know that no business can run without having fixed assets. So, these funds are required to purchase fixed assets like land, building, machinery and furniture and fixtures. So, this is known as fixed capital requirement, where these fixed assets will remain invested in business for a longer period of time. Different business units need varying amount of fixed capital depending on various factors such as nature of business, etc. A trading concern, for example, may require a small amount of fixed capital as compared to the manufacturing concern. So, different business units varying amount of fixed capital depending on the various factors of the nature of the business. So, depending upon the nature of the business, these fixed assets can be bought, and here the example is given that trading concern may require small amount of fixed capital as compared to the manufacturing concern. So, this trading concern will be basically trading with small units. So, is kind of small unit. So, because of that it may require small amount of fixed capital when compared to the manufacturing concern. Now, let us see what is working capital requirement. The financial requirements of a business enterprise do not end with the procurement of fixed assets. No matter how small or large a business is, it needs funds for its day-to-day operations. This is known as working capital of an enterprise, which is used for holding current assets such as stock of material, bills, receivables and for meeting expenses like salaries, wages, taxes and rent. So, under working capital requirement, we can see that business may be small or large, but every business needs funds in order to run its day-to-day operations, and this is known as working capital requirement, and it is used for holding current assets like stock of materials, bills receivables, etc. And for meeting expenses also like salaries, wages, taxes, rent, etc. And the requirement of fixed capital and working capital requirement will increase with the growth and expansion of the business. Let's see the significance of business finance. Business needs finance mainly for acquiring various types of assets and to meet various expenses on day-to-day basis. There are many other reasons for the requirement of business finance. The significance and need of business finance is explained below. Now, when we will see that business needs finance mainly for acquiring various types of assets and to meet various expenses on day-to-day basis. And there are many reasons why the business will need finance. Let's see some of the reasons. First one is to meet capital requirement of business. To purchase fixed assets like land and building, plant and machinery, furniture and fixtures, business requires finance. So, as we have seen already in the fixed capital requirement that here business will need funds in order to purchase the fixed assets like plant, machinery, furniture and fixtures, land and building, etc. So, this is also the reason why the business needs finance. And the next reason is to meet working capital requirement. Working capital is used for holding current assets such as stock of material, payment of wages, transportation expenses, etc. And we have already seen under working capital requirement that here funds are needed in order to run the business operations on day-to-day basis and for holding the current assets such as stock of materials, payments of wages, transportation expenses, etc. And the next one is for growth and expansion. For growth and expansion activities, a business requires finance. It may be required to increase production, to install more machines and to set up R&D center, etc. So, as we already know that for any business to grow, it needs or it requires more and more funds. So, here also the same reason is given that for the growth of business, or if the person or if the owner of the business wants to expand his business, he will require or he needs more funds, and maybe he want to expand his business through the by increasing the production and by installing the new machineries, etc. And the next reason is for survival. To carry out the various business operations in continuity, business finance is needed. Without the required finance, organization cannot survive for long. So, it's very much obvious that without the funds the business cannot be run. So, in order to carry out various business operations in continuity, business needs finance. Next one is for diversification. Business finance is needed to start any new activity in business. For example, ITC dealing with tobacco started ITC Kakatiya Hotels, We Will, classmates, etc. Entering into new businesses and new lines of activities are known as diversification. Similarly, main enterprise keep on grabbing opportunities to start producing products of different segments. So, here also the same is given that if the owner wants to expand his business, he needs to move on to new ideas or innovative ideas. So, here he can also start a new activity in business and he can migrate his activity from the business. So, for this he needs more funds. So, here the example of ITC is given. It is dealing with tobacco and started ITC Kakatiya, that is hotels. And the meaning of diversification is entering into a new business and new lines of activities. So, similarly, every owner or proprietor of the business wants to grab the opportunities which he found very benefited for his organization. And in order to grab those opportunities, he will need more finance. Next one is liabilities. To meet liabilities of the business, be it long term or short term, a business requires sufficient funds. Here the example is given: payment of loan installments to creditors, etc. And the last but not least, another reason is for payment of expenses, for paying salaries, wages, taxes, advertisement. For doing all these activities also business needs more finance. So, therefore, to execute the various plans of business, finance is needed. As we have already discussed that no business can run for a long time without finance. Let's see what is classification of sources of funds. In case of proprietary and partnership concerns, the funds may be raised either from personal sources or borrowings from indigenous bankers or financial institutions, etc. But in case of company form of business organization, the different sources of business finance are available in the market. The sources of funds can be categorized using different bases, that is, on the basis of the period, on the basis of the ownership, and on the basis of source of generation. So, as we have seen in the sole proprietor and partnership concern, their funds were raised by the sole proprietor or the partners of the business, or they may borrow from indigenous bankers or financial institutions. But in case of a company form of business, the different sources of business finance is available in the market. These companies can go towards these business finance sources and they can avail this facility of finance. And these sources of funds can be categorized by using different bases. Let's see what are the sources of finance. So, on the basis of period, sources of funds can be categorized in three ways. They are long term finance, medium term finance, and short term finance. Let's see what is long term finance. Long term sources fulfill the financial requirement of an enterprise for a period exceeding 5 years and includes sources such as shares and debentures, long term borrowings, and loans from financial institutions. So, as the name itself displays, that the long term sources will fulfill the financial requirement of an enterprise for the period which is exceeding up to 5 years, and it includes the sources like shares and debentures, long term borrowings, and loans from financial institutions. And such financing is required for acquisition of fixed assets such as land and building, machinery, etc. Let's see what is medium term finance, where the funds are required for a period of more than 1 year but less than 5 years. Medium term sources of finance are used. So, wherever the funds which are required for the period of more than 1 year but less than 5 years is considered as medium term finance. Let's see what are the sources of medium term finance. So, these sources are borrowings from commercial banks, public deposits, lease financing, and loans from financial institutions. Let's see what is short term sources of finance. Short term funds are those which are required for short duration, that is a period not exceeding 1 year. Trade credit, loans from commercial bank, indigenous bankers, installment credit, advances, bank overdraft credits, and commercial papers are some of the example of short term sources. The name itself says that short term sources will be dealt for the short period of time, and this duration will not exceed 1 year. And the example of short term finance is given, that is loans from commercial bank, trade credit, bankers, installments, etc. Let's see on the basis of ownership. On the basis of ownership, the sources can be classified into owners funds and borrowed funds. Owners funds means funds that are provided by the owner of an enterprise, which may be sole trader or partner or shareholder of a company. Apart from capital, it also includes profits invested in the business. The owner's capital remains invested in the business for a longer duration and is not required to be refunded during the life period of business. Such capital form the basis on which owners acquire their right of control of management. Issue of equity shares and retained earnings are two important sources from where owner funds can be obtained. Borrowed funds, on the other hand, refers to funds raised through loans or borrowings. So, on the basis of ownership also, the sources can be classified into owners fund and borrowed funds. So, on the basis of ownership, these sources can be classified into owners fund and borrowed funds. Owners fund, we already know, as we have seen in sole trading concern and partnership concern. Here in the sole trading concern, the owner of the business will only provide the capital for his business. So, owners fund means the funds that are provided by the owner of a business enterprise. And again, borrowed funds means the funds that are borrowed from other sources of finance and refers to funds which are raised through loans or borrowings. Let's see on the basis of generation. Sources of finance can be generated from internal or an external sources. Internal sources of funds are those that are generated from within the business, such as plowing back of profits, retained earnings, collection of receivables, disposing of surplus, inventories and depreciation of funds, etc. External sources of funds includes those sources that lie outside an organization, such as shares, debentures, public deposits, borrowing from commercial banks and financial institutions, suppliers, lenders and investors. So, here on the basis of generation, we can see that these sources can be generated by two types, that is internal and external. So, under internal sources of funds, we can see that these are those funds that are generated from and within the business. Here the example is given, that is retained earning, collection of receivable, disposable of surplus inventories and depreciation of funds, etc. And for external sources of funds, they include sources that lies outside of an organization, such as shares, debentures, public deposits, borrowing from commercial bank and financial institutions, etc. Let's see some of the factors which determines the choice of the sources of finance. Financial needs of the business are of different types, long term, short term, fixed and fluctuating. Therefore, business firms resort to different types of sources for raising funds. So, financial needs of the business will be of different kinds, as we already know, that may be long term, that may be short term, or that may be fixed or fluctuating. Therefore, business firms will resort to different types of sources for raising the funds. Let's see some of the factors which determines the choice of sources of finance. So, the first one is cost. There are two types of cost, namely the cost of procurement of funds and cost of utilizing the funds. Both these costs should be taken into account while deciding about the source of funds that will be used by an organization. So, the cost has been divided into two types, namely the cost of procurement of funds and the cost of utilizing the funds. So, both of these costs should be taken into the consideration while deciding about the sources of funds that will be used by an organization. And the next one is financial strength and stability of operation. The financial strength of business is also a key determinant in the choice of source of funds for business. Should be in a sound financial position so as to be able to repay the principal amount and interest on the borrowed amount. So, here it explains that if the business owner has taken loan from somewhere, so he should be in a position to repay that loan to the principal. So, the financial strength of the business is also a key determinant. Next one is purpose and time period. Business should plan according to the time period for which the funds are required. A short term needs, for example, can be met through borrowing funds at low rate of interest through trade credit, commercial paper, etc. For long term finance, sources such as issue of shares and debentures are more appropriate. So, every business should plan according to the time period for which the funds are required. So, the example of short term funds is given that for short term need, they can meet the requirement by borrowing funds at low rate of interest and through the trade credit or commercial papers, etc. And for long term needs of business, sources such as issue of shares and debentures are more appropriate. Next one is effect on credit worthiness. The dependence of business on certain sources may affect its credit worthiness in a market. For example, issue of secured debentures may affect the interest of unsecured creditors for the company and may adversely affect their willingness to extend further loans as credit to the company. So, the dependence of the business on certain sources can affect the credit worthiness of the company in the market. Here the example of issue of secured debentures have given that they may affect the interest of secured creditors. And the last one is flexibility and ease. Another aspect affecting the choice of a source of finance is the flexibility and ease of obtaining funds. Restrictive provisions, detailed investigation and documentation in case of borrowings from banks and financial institutions, for example, may be the reason that business organization may not prefer it if other options are readily available. So the another factor which is affecting the choice of the source of business finance is the flexibility and ease of obtaining funds. So there are some restrictive provisions in case of borrowing from banks and financial institution. For example, these financial institution may be the reason that the business organization may not prefer it if other options are available. So here we are done with our 8th chapter, that is business finance. I hope you understood all the topics very well. Let's continue another chapter in next class. Thank you.